Thomas Jefferson, one of the most influential figures in American history, was born on April 13, 1743, at the Shadwell Plantation. This estate, located just outside Charlottesville, Virginia, was part of the prosperous holdings of his father, Peter Jefferson. Peter was a man of significant standing in colonial Virginia, working as both a surveyor and a planter. He owned multiple plantations including Shadwell, which he had established in the 1730s. Like many plantations of that era, Shadwell relied on enslaved labor alongside free workers to sustain its operations, primarily focused on tobacco cultivation. During Jefferson's early years, Virginia was one of the 13 British colonies in North America. However, within a few decades, it would become a leading state in the revolutionary movement that led to the creation of the United States of America. The Jefferson family had deep roots in Virginia, tracing their presence back to 1612. Peter Jefferson was a prominent member of Virginia society, holding respected roles such as a colonel in the militia and a representative in the Virginia House of Burgesses. His leadership and influence left a lasting impression on young Thomas, who admired his father's ability to command respect and maintain authority within the community. Jefferson's mother, Jane Randolph, came from an equally prestigious background. She was a member of the Randolph family, one of the most influential in Virginia's history. The Randolphs had arrived in the colony in 1642, and by the 1670s Jane's grandfather, William Randolph, had amassed tens of thousands of acres of land, establishing a network of 11 plantations. Jane's father, Isham Randolph, was a sea captain whose life alternated between Virginia and London. It was in London, specifically in the Shadwell parish, that Jane was born in February 1720. When she married Peter Jefferson in 1739, they named their plantation Shadwell, a nod to her birthplace. Together, Peter and Jane Jefferson had 8 children, 6 daughters and 2 sons, with Thomas being the eldest. Raised amidst the privileges of the Virginia elite, Thomas spent much of his childhood between 2 estates, Shadwell and Tuckahoe. In 1745, the Jefferson family temporarily moved to Tuckahoe so Peter could oversee the management of the estate, which belonged to his late cousin William Randolph. 7 years later, in 1752, they returned to Shadwell, where Thomas continued his upbringing. Peter Jefferson deeply regretted his lack of formal education and was determined that his son would receive the best schooling available. At the age of 9, Thomas was sent to live with Reverend William Douglas, a clergyman who provided him with foundational lessons in French, as well as in Latin and Greek. Later, he studied under Reverend James Morey, a more accomplished classical scholar, who introduced Thomas to the literature, philosophy, and history of ancient Greece and Rome. This early exposure to classical ideas profoundly shaped Jefferson's intellectual development. Building on this solid foundation, Jefferson enrolled at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia's capital. By the time he left for college, his father had passed away in 1757, leaving Thomas at just 14 years old, as the head of his household. As the eldest son, he inherited the Shadwell estate, which included more than 2,750 acres of land and 66 enslaved individuals. However, the practical management of the estate was handled by his mother Jane, who ensured its continued operation. In 1770, a fire devastated the Shadwell home, reducing it to ruins. Undeterred, Jane Jefferson took it upon herself to rebuild the residence, which remained in the family for 2 subsequent generations. Although much of the correspondence between Thomas and his mother was lost in the fire, evidence suggests that their relationship was amicable. Jefferson continued to live at Shadwell well into adulthood, indicating a stable bond with his mother until her death in 1776. At William and Mary, Jefferson immersed himself in a rigorous academic environment. He studied under Dr. William Small, a Scottish professor who taught mathematics and moral philosophy. Small's teachings introduced Jefferson to the revolutionary ideas of the Enlightenment, an intellectual movement that emphasized reason, science, and human progress over tradition and religious dogma. These concepts had a profound impact on Jefferson, shaping his views on governance and society. Jefferson's academic life was intense. He was known to study for as many as 15 hours a day, devouring works by luminaries such as Isaac Newton, John Locke, and Adam Smith. Despite his heavy study schedule, Jefferson maintained a commitment to physical activity, exercising for 2 hours daily. An accomplished violinist, he also performed regularly at the governor's palace in Williamsburg, where he mingled with Virginia's political elite, including his cousin Peyton Randolph, the Royal Attorney General. The colonial government in Virginia mirrored the structure of the British political system. The king appointed the governor and the Council of State, which acted as the upper house of the General Assembly. The lower house, known as the House of Burgesses, was elected by free white men. Peter Jefferson had represented Albemarle County in the House of Burgesses, and he instilled in his son a strong sense of loyalty to the British Crown. After completing his studies, Jefferson spent 5 years training as a lawyer. He divided his time between Williamsburg and Shadwell during a period when tensions between Britain and its American colonies were steadily rising. These tensions were fueled by Britain's efforts to recover the costs of the 7 Years' War, 1754 to 1763, a global conflict in which Britain had secured significant territorial gains in North America. Although Britain emerged victorious, gaining control of French colonies in Canada and Spanish Florida, the war left the empire heavily indebted. To cover the expenses of maintaining a military presence in North America, British authorities introduced new taxes on the colonies. In 1764, Prime Minister George Grenville announced the Sugar Act, imposing duties on various colonial imports. Grenville declared Parliament's absolute authority to levy taxes across the British Empire, a stance that provoked outrage in the colonies. Virginia, like other colonies, objected vehemently to these measures, asserting that taxes should not be imposed without the consent of colonial representatives. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," became a rallying cry. The situation escalated with the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765, which taxed printed materials, sparking widespread protests organized by groups like the Sons of Liberty. This Boston-founded organization rapidly expanded across the colonies, fueling resistance against British policies. Thomas Jefferson, a keen observer of the passionate debates within the Virginia House of Burgesses, was notably influenced by the speeches of Patrick Henry. Henry, a lawyer renowned for his fiery oratory, became an advocate for the most radical measures of resistance against British policies. His denunciations of the British Crown and Parliament were so vehement that many of his more conservative colleagues accused him of treason. Yet despite the intense rhetoric, even the most outspoken figures like Henry were not advocating for the 13 colonies to sever ties with the British Crown, nor were they suggesting the use of armed conflict to achieve independence. By the end of 1765, the mounting colonial opposition to the Stamp Act prompted the British Parliament to recognize the depth of discontent in the American colonies. The act, which had levied taxes on printed materials, was repealed in February 1766. However, Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, affirming its authority to legislate for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. While the Declaratory Act was intended to preserve Parliament's dignity, it did little to pacify the colonies. The ongoing disputes had evolved from debates about taxation into broader issues concerning political rights and resistance to arbitrary governance. Over the next decade, repeated attempts by Britain to enforce its authority were met with increasing defiance from the colonies. Tensions escalated to the point where the conflict shifted from political discourse to armed confrontation, setting the stage for revolution. During this period, Jefferson embarked on a promising legal career after being admitted to the bar in 1767. Living at Shadwell, his family estate, he traveled extensively to argue cases in courthouses throughout Virginia. His political career began shortly thereafter, as he was elected on December 15, 1768, to represent Albemarle County in the House of Burgesses. This marked the first of many public offices he would hold in a career that would define his legacy. In May of that same year, Jefferson had initiated plans to construct a new residence on a hilltop near Shadwell. He named this estate Monticello, meaning Little Mountain in Italian. Designed by Jefferson himself and constantly remodeled to align with contemporary architectural trends, Monticello would become synonymous with his name. The devastating fire at Shadwell in 1770 accelerated his move to Monticello, despite the house being incomplete. The fire destroyed Jefferson's library and the legal papers he was working on at the time. Nevertheless, Monticello became his permanent home and a symbol of his ingenuity and vision. It was to Monticello that Jefferson brought his wife, Martha Wales Jefferson, following their marriage in January 1772. Known as Patty to her family and close friends, Martha was born in 1748 into a prominent Virginia family. Her father, John Wales, was both a wealthy landowner and a client of Jefferson during his legal career. After being widowed at a young age in 1768, Martha attracted the attention of numerous suitors including Jefferson. The two bonded over their shared love of music, with Jefferson often serenading her on the violin while she accompanied him on the piano. Their marriage, although occasionally marked by disagreements due to Martha's strong-willed nature, was a loving one. Together, they had 6 children, though only 2 survived infancy, reflecting the high child mortality rates of the era. As Jefferson's personal life unfolded, the colony's relationship with Britain continued to deteriorate. The Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, saw members of the Sons of Liberty destroy a shipment of tea in protest against British taxation. This act of defiance prompted Parliament to pass the Intolerable Acts in 1774, including the Boston Port Act, which closed the port until the East India Company was compensated for the lost tea. These punitive measures further galvanized colonial opposition. In Virginia, Jefferson and his peers passed resolutions expressing solidarity with Boston and advocating a boycott of British goods. Amidst the growing unrest, the First Continental Congress convened on September 5, 1774, in Philadelphia. Although Jefferson was not a delegate, he made a significant contribution by drafting a document titled A Summary View of the Rights of British America. In this pamphlet, Jefferson articulated the colony's grievances and argued for their right to self-governance, urging King George III to address these issues fairly. His eloquent plea for equality and justice elevated him to prominence among colonial leaders, showcasing his exceptional abilities as a political writer. By late 1774, it became evident that reconciliation between Britain and its American colonies was unlikely. Both sides prepared for conflict, with the colonies mobilizing militias to counter potential military crackdowns. The situation reached a breaking point on April 19, 1775, when the first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. This marked the beginning of an armed struggle that would ultimately lead to the birth of a new nation. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May 1775, initially under the presidency of Peyton Randolph. However, Randolph was soon recalled to Williamsburg to oversee the proceedings of the Virginia House of Burgesses. In his absence, Thomas Jefferson was chosen as his replacement, arriving in Philadelphia on June 11. By this time, the escalating hostilities between Britain and the colonies had transformed the Congress into a permanent governing body, tasked with uniting the colonies in their resistance and coordinating efforts in what was rapidly evolving into a full-scale war. Shortly after Jefferson's arrival, the Congress approved John Adams's proposal to appoint George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, a pivotal step in organizing the colonial forces. Unlike some of his peers, Jefferson was not a gifted orator. He preferred working behind the scenes, contributing his talents in drafting resolutions, declarations, and reports. His mastery of the written word allowed him to influence policy and public opinion from a quieter, more strategic position. By June 1776, the Congress had begun deliberations on the critical issue of whether to formally declare independence from the British Empire. Jefferson, alongside John Adams, was selected to draft the declaration. Recognizing Jefferson's superior writing skills and his role as a representative of Virginia, the largest and most influential colony, Adams persuaded him to compose the initial draft. Jefferson's draft began with an introduction articulating the colony's intent to sever ties with the British Crown. The preamble, however, became the cornerstone of the Declaration of Independence, encapsulating the foundational principles of the emerging nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. This powerful statement was followed by an extensive list of grievances against King George III. Jefferson framed the monarch as the primary antagonist, effectively prosecuting him in the court of public opinion. This deliberate shift away from blaming Parliament ensured that reconciliation would no longer be possible, as the king had previously been viewed as a protector of colonial rights. When Jefferson's draft was debated by Congress, several alterations were made to moderate its tone and content. A particularly contentious passage condemning slavery and the transatlantic slave trade was removed to appease delegates from the southern colonies, whose economies were deeply reliant on enslaved labor. Although Jefferson expressed disappointment at these revisions, he took pride in knowing that the document ratified on July 4, 1776, contained words that would resonate through the ages. Having gained international recognition as a principal advocate for American independence, Jefferson yearned to return to Virginia. His personal life had been marked by loss. In the preceding year he had endured the deaths of his mother, one of his daughters, and his cousin, Peyton Randolph. Adding to his burdens, Jefferson's wife Martha was in fragile health. For these reasons, he declined an invitation to join a diplomatic mission to France aimed at securing an alliance with King Louis XVI. While Jefferson remained in Virginia, the Franco-American alliance was successfully formalized in February 1778, giving the colonies a crucial advantage. Jefferson turned his focus to reforming Virginia's legal and political systems, striving to dismantle the entrenched power of the landed elite and broaden access to education. He was particularly devoted to the cause of religious freedom, arguing that no faith could claim absolute truth. Although his proposals for religious tolerance were initially rejected, they would be revisited and adopted a decade later. On the issue of slavery, Jefferson found himself in a complex moral quandary. While he opposed the institution in principle and saw it as incompatible with the ideals of liberty, he remained a slaveholder throughout his life, owning over 600 individuals. Jefferson doubted the possibility of coexistence between free black and white populations, a perspective that shaped his actions or lack thereof on this issue. As the Revolutionary War raged on, Virginia faced increasing threats from British forces. In 1779, Jefferson was elected governor of Virginia, assuming the role of civilian war leader during a period of immense peril. He dealt with internal Loyalist uprisings and Native American raids while relocating the state capital from Williamsburg to Richmond, a safer inland location. Despite these precautions, Virginia was invaded in December 1780 by Benedict Arnold, a former Continental Army general who had defected to the British. Jefferson's response was slow, narrowly avoiding capture as Arnold's troops sacked Richmond. The British campaign escalated in the spring of 1781, with Lord Cornwallis and Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton leading a brutal southern offensive. Jefferson relocated the capital again, this time to Charlottesville, and urgently appealed to George Washington for reinforcements to save Virginia from collapse. In the early hours of June 4, 1781, as Thomas Jefferson prepared to relinquish his position as governor of Virginia, he was at Monticello when alarming news reached him. British cavalry under the command of Bannister Tarleton was approaching his estate with orders to capture him. Once again, Jefferson narrowly escaped British hands, fleeing just in time. After stepping down as governor, Jefferson faced scrutiny from the Virginia General Assembly regarding his actions during the tumultuous final year of his term. Although he was ultimately exonerated of any wrongdoing, Jefferson felt that his reputation had been tarnished. This sense of disillusionment persisted, even as the tide of the war turned in favor of the Americans. On October 19, 1781, Lord Cornwallis surrendered to General George Washington and his French allies at Yorktown, effectively ending large-scale hostilities and paving the way for peace talks that would recognize American independence. Jefferson's political struggles were soon overshadowed by personal tragedy. His wife Martha gave birth to a daughter in May 1782, but her health rapidly declined thereafter. Confined to bed, she passed away on September 6, 1782, with Jefferson by her side. In the midst of his grief, Jefferson accepted an invitation in 1783 to join the American delegation engaged in peace negotiations in Paris. However, before his departure, he learned that the treaty's draft terms had already been agreed upon, offering the fledgling United States remarkably favorable conditions. These terms were designed to isolate France and Spain, America's allies, from further territorial or political gains. Instead, Jefferson was elected on June 6, 1783, to represent Virginia at the Continental Congress, a fragile national body with limited authority. Jefferson believed that the weaknesses of the Congress posed a risk of disunity and potential conflict among the states. This became evident when Congress struggled to assemble the necessary quorum to ratify the Treaty of Paris, which was only achieved on January 14, 1784. On July 5, 1784, after less than a year in Congress, Jefferson embarked on a diplomatic mission to France as the United States ambassador. Jefferson had long admired France, particularly for its alliance with America during the Revolutionary War, and he saw this appointment as an opportunity to strengthen ties and ensure American security in the event of future British aggression. Jefferson's time in France coincided with the nation's descent into revolution. King Louis XVI's government was deeply in debt, exacerbated by France's military support of the American Revolution. While the French common people faced dire poverty and hunger, the aristocracy and the Catholic Church resisted efforts to impose taxes on their wealth. With few options remaining, the king reluctantly convened the Estates General in 1789, a political assembly that had not been called in over 150 years. The gathering of the Estates General led to a surge of proposals for reform, as representatives from the church, nobility, and commoners debated the future of French governance. Jefferson observed these developments closely, welcoming the possibility of an end to royal absolutism. Even while stationed in Paris, Jefferson remained deeply involved in American affairs. He closely followed the Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia from May 25 to September 17, 1787, where delegates sought to establish a stronger federal government. Though Jefferson had previously criticized the weaknesses of the national government under the Articles of Confederation, his experiences in revolutionary France caused him to fear that an overly powerful central government could lead to tyranny. When Jefferson reviewed the draft constitution, he approved of its separation of powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. However, he expressed concerns about the presidency, which lacked term limits and could potentially allow a single individual to remain in office indefinitely. He was also disappointed by the absence of a Bill of Rights to safeguard individual and state freedoms against federal overreach. Despite its imperfections, Jefferson supported the Constitution, trusting that it could be improved through amendments. This faith was validated when a Bill of Rights was adopted as the first 10 amendments before the Constitution's ratification on June 21, 1788. During Jefferson's final months in France, the French Revolution erupted. Unable to resolve procedural disputes, representatives of the Third Estate, the commoners, declared themselves the National Assembly. As unrest spread, royal authority crumbled, culminating in the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789. Jefferson maintained close friendships with key revolutionaries, including the Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought alongside Washington during the American Revolution. Lafayette, then one of France's most admired figures, served as commander of the National Guard, tasked with maintaining order in Paris and protecting the royal family from radical factions. Collaborating with Lafayette, Jefferson helped draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted by the National Assembly on August 26, 1789. This landmark document, which proclaimed that human beings are born and remain free and equal in rights, echoed the principles Jefferson had articulated in the Declaration of Independence. Having contributed significantly to both French and American political developments, Jefferson left France in late September 1789. Returning to Virginia on November 23, he planned to resume his diplomatic duties. However, in December, he was appointed Secretary of State by President George Washington, who had been unanimously elected under the new Constitution and inaugurated on April 30, 1789. As Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson assumed the role of President George Washington's chief foreign policy advisor, a position well suited to his extensive diplomatic experience in France and his deep understanding of international relations. Accepting Washington's invitation, Jefferson departed Virginia for New York, which at the time served as the nation's capital, and officially began his duties in March 1790. While Jefferson's primary responsibilities centered on managing the young nation's foreign affairs, his role as a member of Washington's cabinet inevitably involved him in the broader debates shaping the United States' political future. The cabinet itself was composed of individuals with diverse visions for the country's path forward, reflecting a range of perspectives on governance, economics, and federal authority. Jefferson's voice in these discussions often emphasized the importance of individual liberty, state sovereignty, and a restrained federal government, aligning with his philosophical convictions. As Secretary of State, Jefferson served as President Washington's chief foreign policy advisor, a role well suited to his diplomatic experience in France. He accepted the position and relocated from Virginia to New York, the federal government's seat at the time, officially beginning his duties in March 1790. Although Jefferson's primary responsibility was foreign affairs, his position in Washington's cabinet also immersed him in debates about the future political direction of the United States. The administration was largely dominated by the Federalists, a faction that advocated for a strong central government as essential to national prosperity and security. Among its leading figures were Vice President John Adams and Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, who had been one of Washington's closest confidants since the Revolutionary War. Hamilton, at just 34 years old, had already left a significant mark on American politics, authoring the majority of the Federalist Papers and championing the Constitution's adoption in 1789. Jefferson, by contrast, identified as a Democratic Republican, firmly opposing Federalist policies. He believed in defending states' rights and individual liberties against potential overreach by the federal government. Jefferson saw Hamilton's vision as favoring northern commercial elites over the agrarian interests of the southern states, fostering conditions for tyranny akin to what the Revolution had sought to overthrow. A sharp ideological rivalry developed between Jefferson and Hamilton, with tensions flaring over Hamilton's financial proposals. Hamilton sought to establish a national bank to manage the debt, consolidate state debts under federal control, and empower Congress to levy taxes to repay them. These measures were strongly supported by debt-laden northern states like New York and Massachusetts, but vehemently opposed by southern states like Virginia and North Carolina, which had managed their finances more prudently. The stalemate in Congress was broken through a compromise brokered by Jefferson and Hamilton. The southern states agreed to Hamilton's proposals in exchange for relocating the federal capital to a more southern location along the Potomac River, in what would become Washington, D.C. The domestic policy debate spilled over into foreign policy. While Federalists like Adams and Hamilton sought to rebuild ties with Great Britain, Jefferson favored closer relations with revolutionary France, whose ideals mirrored those of the American Revolution. However, the increasingly radical turn of the French Revolution, particularly the Jacobin-led Reign of Terror in 1793, tested Jefferson's pro-French stance. The executions of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, along with the exile of moderates like Lafayette, lent credibility to Federalist warnings of revolutionary anarchy. Despite these developments, Jefferson remained loyal to the ideals of the French Revolution. When France declared war on Britain in February 1793, Jefferson privately opposed Washington's proclamation of neutrality. However, his position was weakened by the conduct of French envoy Edmond Charles Genet, who openly criticized Washington and attempted to draw the United States into hostilities with Britain. By late 1793, the political animosity between Jefferson and Hamilton reached a breaking point. Both men offered their resignations, but while Washington persuaded Hamilton to stay, he reluctantly accepted Jefferson's resignation on January 1, 1794. Retreating to Monticello, Jefferson spent the next 2 years in semi-retirement, remodeling his home and enjoying a respite from national politics. Nevertheless, he kept a watchful eye on developments through correspondence with Republican allies. The ratification of the Jay Treaty in 1795 was a particularly bitter blow. While the treaty improved trade relations with Britain and was celebrated by Federalists, it infuriated Republicans and provoked outrage in France, straining Franco-American relations. After intense political battles, the Senate narrowly approved the treaty in August 1795, and it took effect in early 1796. However, it wasn't until April of that year that Congress, following a narrow vote, allocated the necessary funds to fulfill its terms. Following this political setback and with Washington's second term nearing its end, the Republicans began searching for a challenger to the presidency. The choice was clear: Thomas Jefferson. On September 19, 1796, President Washington published his farewell address, announcing his decision to retire from public life and not seek a third term. In this address, he urged national unity and warned against the spirit of party, which he saw as a source of political instability and a potential pathway to despotism under the guise of restoring order. Washington had witnessed firsthand how the rivalry between Jefferson and Hamilton had strained his administration. Despite his warnings, Washington's retirement ushered in the first truly contested presidential election in American history. The Federalists backed John Adams for the presidency, while the Democratic Republicans rallied behind Jefferson. Under the Constitution at the time, each elector in the Electoral College cast 2 votes. The candidate with the majority became president, and the runner-up became vice president. Electors were chosen by state legislatures in most states, and political networks, rather than public campaigning, played the decisive role. After the votes were counted, Adams narrowly defeated Jefferson, securing 71 electoral votes to Jefferson's 68. On March 4, 1797, John Adams became the second president of the United States, with Jefferson as his vice president. Though once close allies, the growing ideological divide between the Federalists and Republicans had strained their relationship. Adams's presidency unfolded in a tense international atmosphere, with fears of war involving Britain or France casting a shadow over American politics. In 1798, Adams revealed that an American delegation to France had been met with demands for bribes by French officials, an incident known as the XYZ affair. Public outrage ensued, and relations with France deteriorated, leading to the undeclared Quasi-War, during which French naval forces attacked American shipping. In response, Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which empowered the president to deport foreigners deemed a security risk and made it illegal to publish defamatory statements about the government. Jefferson, viewing these measures as a dangerous step toward authoritarianism, quietly orchestrated Republican opposition to the laws through press criticism and advice to state governments. Jefferson's vice presidency was fraught with challenges. While publicly supporting the administration, he privately acted as a leader of the opposition. The tension culminated in the 1800 election, as Adams and Jefferson prepared for a rematch. By this time, the federal government had moved from Philadelphia to its permanent home in Washington, D.C., a city named for the late President Washington, who had died on December 14, 1799. The 1800 election was one of the most contentious in American history. Jefferson's running mate, Aaron Burr, played a crucial role in securing Republican dominance in New York, which helped swing the election. However, when the Electoral College votes were tallied, Jefferson and Burr were tied with 73 votes each, throwing the decision to the House of Representatives. The House, dominated by Federalists, deliberated for 6 days starting on February 11, 1801. Federalists sought to exploit the situation, some supporting Burr to deny Jefferson the presidency. Behind the scenes, negotiations took place. Jefferson refused to agree to conditions that would restrict his policy decisions but eventually gained the support needed to prevail. On February 17, 1801, after 36 ballots, Jefferson was elected president. Ironically, Jefferson's victory owed much to Alexander Hamilton, who disliked both Jefferson and Burr but regarded Jefferson as the lesser of two evils. Hamilton's influence persuaded several Federalists to switch their votes to Jefferson. This rivalry with Burr would later culminate in their infamous duel in 1804, which resulted in Hamilton's death. On March 4, 1801, Thomas Jefferson was sworn in as the third President of the United States. In his inaugural address, he called for unity, famously stating, "Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have been called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." This appeal to moderation reassured those who feared Jefferson would dismantle Federalist institutions, though he did appoint key Republican allies to his cabinet. As Secretary of State, the new president selected James Madison, his Virginia protege who had been a trusted source of political counsel for nearly 3 decades. Albert Gallatin, a Pennsylvanian Republican and a prominent leader in opposing the Alien and Sedition Acts in the House of Representatives, was appointed Secretary of the Treasury. During his 8-year presidency, Jefferson reduced federal obligations, cutting the national debt from $83 million to $57 million and scaling back military expenditures to pre-war levels. He dismissed the value of engaging in an arms race with European powers, favoring neutrality in their conflicts. Jefferson's presidency is most notably linked to America's westward expansion. Although he never traveled west of Virginia, his father's experiences on the western frontier had intrigued him since childhood. Early leaders of the American Republic feared European powers in North America, particularly Britain and Spain, as well as indigenous tribes, might obstruct the nation's expansion beyond the Mississippi River. These concerns intensified following the Third Treaty of San Ildefonso in October 1800, a secret Franco-Spanish agreement transferring the Louisiana Territory to France in exchange for Italian lands. Napoleon Bonaparte, then First Consul of France, appeared intent on establishing a new empire in North America, a prospect that alarmed Jefferson, as French control of New Orleans threatened the economic lifeline of the southern states. Despite his Francophile inclinations, Jefferson was willing to ally with Britain to safeguard American interests. However, he first sought to purchase New Orleans from Napoleon. Jefferson tasked James Monroe with negotiating alongside Robert Livingston, the American ambassador in Paris. Monroe, a former Virginia governor and longtime friend of Jefferson and Madison, handled the sensitive mission. By early 1803, shifting developments made the sale of New Orleans more appealing to Napoleon. The fragile peace between France and Britain was unraveling, and Napoleon's ambitions in the Americas had suffered a major blow following the disastrous loss of his forces to yellow fever in Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti. Faced with these challenges and aware of Louisiana's vulnerability to British attack, Napoleon offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million. Monroe and Livingston finalized the agreement in April 1803, and Congress ratified it in October, more than doubling the nation's size overnight. Although Jefferson was celebrated for the Louisiana Purchase, Critics accused him of overstepping constitutional limits since Congress had allocated only $10 million for the deal. Despite his reservations about expanding executive power, Jefferson defended the acquisition. Even before the purchase, Jefferson had secured congressional approval for an expedition to explore the Western Territories. He appointed Captain Meriwether Lewis, a Virginian and Revolutionary War veteran, to lead the mission. Lewis invited Lieutenant William Clark to co-lead, and together they formed the Corps of Discovery. Departing from St. Louis in 1804, the expedition reached the Pacific in 1805, returning by 1806. Jefferson avidly followed their progress, dedicating a room in the presidential mansion to display their natural artifacts and accounts. Jefferson's vision of westward expansion embodied his ideal of an agrarian republic. His first-term achievements, including tax reductions and the Louisiana Purchase, earned him widespread popularity. Despite Federalist opposition in the press, Jefferson won re-election in 1804 by a landslide, securing 162 electoral votes to 14. His second term, however, brought challenges. Vice President Aaron Burr's political career ended after killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel, and rumors of Burr's treasonous plans led to his arrest and trial in 1807. In foreign policy, Jefferson faced increasing tensions with Britain. Following the Chesapeake Leopard affair in 1807, he implemented the Embargo Act, halting trade with all foreign nations. While the act prevented war and encouraged domestic industry, it was widely unpopular due to rising costs of goods. Jefferson retired to Monticello in 1809, spending his later years with family and maintaining correspondence with John Adams, with whom he rekindled a friendship. Both men died on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of American independence. While Jefferson is celebrated as a visionary statesman, his legacy is marred by contradictions regarding slavery. DNA evidence supports claims that he fathered children with Sally Hemings, but Jefferson kept most of his slaves in bondage, unlike George Washington, who freed his upon his death. Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming all men as equals, remain a stark contrast to the realities of slavery during and long after his time. Thomas Jefferson's legacy of liberty, education, and innovation continues to shape the fabric of our nation, inspiring generations to strive for a more perfect union. However, his complex relationship with slavery raises important questions about the contradictions between his ideals and his actions. What are your thoughts on Thomas Jefferson's legacy? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and inspiring. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what topics you'd like to see next.